And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Saulius Sužiedėlis, University of Millersville, member of the International Historical Commission, an outstanding expert of Holocaust. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, it is now commonplace to speak of divided memory in Eastern Europe. And they are sometimes treated as a barrier that protects us from the so-called shared history that should unite us in some political or cultural sense. And I would like to shortly present to you some of my impressions and raise a question why memories differ so much. I think the reasons are several. One is quite simple, that our experiences have been really different, let's say, if we compare Lithuanians and other nations. Another is the policy of forgetting, which is sometimes conscious. And Timothy Schneider, Yale University historian, has recently issued a book that was translated into Lithuanian, The Bloody Land, where he tried to combine the different history in geographical terms, understanding that during the Second World War, many innocent civil people were killed in those lands, including Lithuania and the Baltic states, Ukraine, and China. Quite a great number of people killed during the Second World War were killed, namely in those places. The author also tried to combine the history starting from 1933, covering Holodomor in Ukraine. It has to be noted that this book was received quite positively in the West, not to mention the criticism of some Jewish researchers who didn't like undermining the effect of the Second World War, because the author spoke about two things at the same time, and rather than focus on the moral aspect. I'm not going to compare two totalitarian regimes because many presenters have already spoken about that. However, Timothy Schneider, when visiting Lithuania in May this year, made a very interesting remark by saying that some people criticize me for comparing socialism and Nazism. And speaking about Western world memories of the Second World War, like Sandra Kalniete, Latvian MP today, said, the Second World War is understood like a conflict of white and black, and it has several important psychological aspects. One of them is extermination of entire nations that mostly touched Jewish and Poles. And finally, there was also liberation in spite of all the losses. The State of Israel was reborn after Holocaust. Sufferings ended and something better emerged. Or let's say even though Poles have lost a lot of people, they have acquired some Western lands, whereas in Lithuania, all those narrative pillars have no meaning. I would like to move you to Ulbinai Cemetery. Ulbinai village is close to Varėna town. You can see the border of Belarus from there. It's a beautiful place, as you can see. Quite a number of graves, a lake nearby, a calm and nice place indeed. Most people buried here belonged to 4 families: Sužiedėliai, Maroskai, Švedai, and Ulbinai. But coming back to our topic, there are 3 graves in this cemetery. One belongs to Anna Komarovskaya, Tamara Ulbinova, and 4 children: Jan, Gene, Václavas, and Tadeusz. Václav was 4 years old, Tadeusz was a baby of 7 months old. There is a Polish plate there. And this is another view of the same grave. While here, 5 meters from the first one, there is another grave. The plate says there is Juozas Švedas, 17-year-old boy. Saying, "Rest in peace, our dear son and brother." You can't read much of this, but it's a grave of Marita Kamarauskaitė, 17-year-old girl. But what is most important is the date. The 8th of May, 1945. That was the day when German authorities decided to give up. However, there isn't much connection between these families and the date. My late uncle told me that after the war, everything started. And I was wondering, how should I explain this? His hell was breaking loose. How should I explain this to a foreigner? Well, one of my aunts was Švedienė, one of my uncle was also married to Kamarauskaitė, and the history was as follows. That night, Lithuanian insurgents attacked the village, and probably someone decided to attack and shot Ulanova and her children. One of the men decided to go to the village to buy weapons and take revenge. Well, that was the fight against occupants, but that also had some other aspects. What I'm trying to tell you is that chronological frame of this war is quite different to Lithuanians compared to the others. When the war started, most Lithuanians seemed to be happy because that was right after the recent deportations in 1941. Lithuanians met German soldiers as liberators. But the end of the war, that was celebrated by crowds in London, Paris, everywhere, meant hell for Kamarovsky, Sužiedėlis, and other families here in Lithuania, which means that the Nazi occupation was not the worst period for Lithuanian people. The situation is even more distinct in Estonia. It has been determined that during Nazi occupation period, about 8,000 Estonian people were killed. I mean civil residents. It was only Norway and Denmark that had less victims during the war. However, if we speak about post-war Stalinism, it required many more victims. As described by Olaf Merkels, a German historian, in one monography, Stalinism was worse compared to Nazi for those people, and we can prove it statistically if we count how many Lithuanians, ethnic Lithuanians, were killed during the war and post-war period. The war ended in another aspect for Lithuanians and Latvians, also Estonians. Hundreds of thousands of people, alien people, colonizers, arrived, unable to speak their language. So the end of the war meant flooding of alien occupants and their helpers. So due to these reasons, it is very difficult to compare the memory. I intended to speak about Lithuanian and Polish memory in the beginning, because the conflict between Lithuanians and Poles became especially harsh, especially in the Eastern Lithuania. And if we look at the documents of exile government, where it's written that Lithuanians are uncivilized peasants who persecute Poles, whereas in Lithuanian papers we read about Lithuanians' impressions of Poles who feel superior to everyone else. So can say that we can't question the memory. Historians have the right and the duty to question the memory, because if we speak about social or collective memory, it is selective. It changes with time. This is not the same as inserting the text into the disk and have the same even after a long period of time. We resist some narratives and memories. Speaking about Soviet historiography, the tendency has remained up to date. It mainly dealt with bourgeois nationalists with the aim to discredit the resistential movement, whereas the Western narrative was quite different from ours. And when speaking about Lithuania, it mostly focused on Lithuania's participation in the Holocaust of Jews. I'm not saying that it was everywhere, but the trend was quite obvious. Just a few things in this regard. In one book issued in Canada in about 1982, it was announced that Algirdas Klimaitis was the Prime Minister of the Provisional Government of Lithuania. And that was a mistake. How did it happen? In one famous historian, Hilbert's book, we find a phrase saying that Klimaitis was the leader of insurgents, of partisans, and that was not the case. And then someone understood that the head of partisans was supposed to be the head of the government. What I would like to emphasize here is that the uprising of June 1941 was overevaluated in many publications, where the numbers of insurgents, Soviet rebels, amounted to 100,000. And that is five-fold more than in reality. However, some historians took this figure as a proof of massive collaboration. All the narratives I could mention now are probably four main ones. For instance, the Western Grand Alliance narrative, and we need to understand this without much complaining. Let's recall the fact that American journalists in the post-war years understood what the victory of the UK and the US was based on. The American army lost about 40 times less people compared to the Soviet Union, which means that about 40 soldiers died for one American soldier. And this is probably why we have such an anti-Soviet attitude in that society. There is a Soviet narrative as well about the Great Patriotic War story, defeat of fascism. I would like to stress another thing here in the memory of Lithuanians. Anti-fascist narrative is not quite successful, especially among the Soviet diaspora. For instance, what kind of fascists my parents saw. There is no need for further comment. I would just like to touch upon another aspect and raise a few questions and reasons regarding memory. The Nazi occupation that lasted for 3 years in the Baltic states is a fact. It was rather mild compared to the Soviet occupation of 1940-1941 and what was happening after the war. And that greatly influenced what we tend to remember and what we tend to forget. The memory is quite distinct, and my colleague wrote about 7 types of memories, because historians working with the documentation of the war period clearly see where people make mistakes. For instance, they see that people were not wearing these uniforms. Sometimes people just remember the episode, traumatic episodes, but the context is disappearing. And in my view, the biggest problem in memory politics is that in Lithuanian memory, there was no Holocaust for a very long time. Whereas the massacre of Soviet captives was also seemed to be forgotten, whereas the number amounted to about 100,000. For instance, in many publications we read that Nazis killed a lot of Lithuanians and Jews, and this is the forgetfulness politics which is active. Or Arad's case that was quite famous a few years ago. Just to think how a 15-year-old boy runs away from ghetto to Lithuanian forests, joins the insurgents unit, and then just imagine what repercussions it might have on global scale. I also know that just mention the fact in many places, which is quite easy to prove, the bloodiest epoch in Lithuania's history was when about 120 to 130 Lithuanian Jews were killed starting from the middle of August. And even the mention of this fact raises indignation. So most probably we should concentrate more on the statistical data. And in human terms, probably we should start to be more emphatic. Speaking about a memory policy, if the state started formation of memory, it wouldn't give any good, because this memory has to form by itself during discussions and be based on public interaction. If we try to stick to half public, half state narrative, it wouldn't do any good. And there is a human tendency to do this, because people seem to look for easily understandable narratives. They don't like conflicting interpretations of events and facts. And those who are really interested could look into the Civil War in the history of the United States, which was the bloodiest period and the bloodiest event in the US policy. And if you read about it, you will realize that the memory of that war was changing at least 3 times, immensely, due to very simple reasons. I wouldn't like to go too much in detail about it now. So this is the problem. We need to have a deep insight and be quite cautious in following that way. The last point I would like to tell you about is that, which shows that even historians have feelings. For instance, as a historian, I myself try to remain professional, look attentively into sources, whether they are trustworthy, whether they are not really such, and try to avoid emotions. However, once I failed in doing that. About 4 years ago, I participated in a conference in New York, Jewish Research Center, Jewish Study Institution, Jews among Soviet troops. 2 Jewish presenters made speeches, and then during the reception they put on the last Soviet uniforms. Many people wanted to have a picture together with those veterans. Someone asked me whether I would like to have a picture together with those elderly people. I thought, well, why not in the beginning? But then emotions rose inside me, and even though I have nothing against those elderly men, but it seemed that sometimes it's very difficult to conquer certain emotions inside yourself. Well, I've been speaking quite a lot about cemeteries and emotions. Thank you for your patience indeed. And if you have any questions later, I will be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Dėkojam profesoriui Sužiedėliui už įdomų.
Thank you, Professor Sužiedėlis, for your very interesting presentation.